Hello, everyone. Hello, young people. My name is Professor Nemata Blyden. I am a professor of history at the University of Virginia. I'm a professor of African American Studies. I'm in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Virginia. I am also the great-granddaughter of Edward Wilmot Blyden, about who I'm going to speak to you today. I've entitled this presentation, Son of the Virgin Islands, Son of Africa, Edward Wilmot Blyden, Son of the Virgin Islands, Son of Africa. And I hope that you will understand what I mean as I go through the presentation. You are all in the Virgin Islands, so you've learned a little bit, I think, about Edward Wilmot Blyden. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about him. He was born to Romeo and Judith Blyden on the island of St. Thomas in the neighborhood of Charlotte Amalie. At 18 years of age, he left St. Thomas to settle in Liberia, which is in West Africa. He attended Alexander High School and Liberia College while he was there, and I'll talk more about that. So here's some images of Charlotte Amalie, St. Thomas, where he was educated by his parents and also in schools in St. Thomas. In 1842, his father, who was a tailor, moved the family to Portobello, Venezuela, when Blyden was about 10 years old, and there he learned how to speak Spanish. They came back 2 years later, and the family continued their lives in St. Thomas. They were members of the Dutch Reformed Church in St. Thomas. And the picture at the bottom is a plaque that is now at the Dutch Reformed Church in St. Thomas in tribute to Edward Wilmot Blyden. So here is a little piece by Blyden himself, writing about himself, giving his biography. In 1861, he writes about his native place being St. Thomas, talks about where he was born, and says, "I was blessed with the care of pious parents. To the influence of my excellent and devoted mother, who is still alive, more than to any other earthly cause can I trace whatever literary tastes and religious aspirations I possess." So he's giving credit to his mother for being essentially what was his first teacher. And then he writes a little bit more about some of the things that I've told you. He went to Liberia, as I said, as an 18-year-old, was educated at the Alexander High School, and then later on became principal of Liberia College. And here's a picture of Liberia College from 1861. So while he was in Africa, in Liberia, he did a lot of important things. He achieved a lot of things, and here are some of the things. Some I've talked about already. He was a principal of the high school. He was a professor of classics, that is Greek and Latin, at Liberia College. He was a newspaper editor. He founded a newspaper in Sierra Leone. He was a diplomat. He was the ambassador to the Court of St. James in England. He was the president of Liberia College, as I said. He was an advisor to governments. He was also the director of Muslim education, and again served as ambassador both to England and to France. He was very much interested in religion. As I said before, he grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church. He was later on a Presbyterian minister, and so he wrote a lot about Christianity, but he also wrote a lot about Islam. And he was very interested in Muslim people in Africa and the influences they had on African life and customs and history. And he mingled quite a bit with many Muslim people in West Africa. And here on this slide, you will see Blyden at the opening of a very famous mosque in Lagos, Nigeria in 1894. The Shita Bay Mosque was opened or was inaugurated, and Edward Blyden was in attendance. And so you can see the mosque on the right-hand side, a picture of the mosque, and on the left, a picture of the inauguration or the opening of the mosque. And you can see from the little blurb all the people, very important people who attended that opening of the mosque, and Edward Wilmot Blyden was one of those people, and he's sitting there right in the front on that chair. You can see him there. Blyden, over the course of his life, met a lot of important people. He corresponded with many people. that we know as important people or famous people. William Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister of England, was a correspondent of Blyden. He knew and met Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, who was the bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and African American. Here we're seeing a little article that's describing a dinner he had at the home of Frederick Douglass, who I hope all of you know who Frederick Douglass was. And this article from 1880 describes a dinner that was put on by Frederick Douglass and Dr. Edward Blyden, who was at that time the ambassador to England, was invited to that dinner, and it lists all the people who were at the dinner, including two of Frederick Douglass's sons. So we can think of Edward Blyden in the way this person, Harry Johnston, describes him, as a person of note or a person of importance. And that's one of the reasons why you're learning about him in your unit. And Harry Johnston, in a book about Liberia, wrote about Edward Blyden, his background, about coming from St. Thomas and coming to Liberia, and describes him as someone who became a person of note owing to his exceptionally good education. So throughout his life, Blyden was interested in furthering his education, in pursuing knowledge, and becoming a learned person. So here, Harry Johnston talks about him as being well-versed in Latin and Greek literature. He became subsequently an Arabic scholar and was conversant with several European languages besides English. He is the author amongst many other books. So he was very much a person of note and a person who was interested in education. Edward Blyden is also often described as the father of Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism is the idea that people of African descent, wherever they are, should unify and collaborate with each other. It's a philosophy that believes in racial solidarity and pride in African ancestry. And throughout his life, Blyden wrote about, made statements about, talked about this idea of what we now call Pan-Africanism. And so I have here some quotes by Blyden that sort of illustrate this point. He says, in 1874, I would rather be a member of this race, that is an African, than a Greek in the time of Alexander, a Roman in the Augustan period, or an Anglo-Saxon in the 19th century. In 1862, he said, we need some African power, some great center of the race where our physical, pecuniary, that is economic, and intellectual strength may be collected. We need some spot where such an influence may go forth in behalf of the race as shall be felt by the nations. We are now so scattered and divided that we can do nothing. So he's saying, let's come together. And he says, we need to collect the scattered forces of the race, and there is no rallying ground more favorable than Africa. So he was calling for coming together, and coming together, if possible, on the continent of Africa. And this is where Blyden lived out his life, on the continent of Africa. As I said, when I began, he came when he was a young man, 18 years old, and he lived to be an old man, and he died in 1912 in Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa, and he's buried in Sierra Leone. And here in this slide, you can see his gravestone that was put up for him when he died in 1912. And the people who put up the grave call themselves his African friends and admirers. And you can see his eulogy or what they wrote about him. So live that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan that moves to the pale realms of shade, where each shall dwell, shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, right? So they're saying, he's resting now in peace. And so that's just a little bit of information about Edward Wilmot Blyden, a son of the Virgin Islands and a son of Africa, somebody who we should all be proud of. And I hope that you will learn more about Edward Wilmot Blyden. Thank you very much.